Thanks for coming back to Animal Encounters. Today, I'm breaking down 6 bear attacks that started with people brushing off danger they should have taken seriously. From a couple who called grizzlies overgrown dogs and left a cooler by their tent, to a rancher who brushed off large tracks before heading into a field of cattle carcasses after dark. First up is a Montana campsite, where a couple ignored a fresh bear warning and went to sleep with food still sitting outside. It was September 17th, 2019. A primitive campground sat along a forest road in western Montana, tucked into thick timber with a creek running behind the sites. No camp host stayed overnight, no cell signal reached the area, and only one printed sign near the entrance warned campers about recent grizzly activity nearby. Glenn Weaver was 52, a delivery driver from Idaho, and Angela Weaver was 49, a dental assistant. Married 23 years, camping was basically their whole thing whenever Glenn could get a long weekend off. Neither of them had much real experience in grizzly country though, and according to the campground host who checked them in, Glenn laughed off the warning sign completely, comparing the bears to overgrown dogs with worse manners. I mean, technically, yes, it has fur and 4 legs, it also weighs several hundred pounds and can pull apart an elk carcass, so maybe not the animal to get casual about. Grizzlies in early autumn go through something called hyperphagia, basically eating non-stop before winter denning. Adult males can hit 400 to 700 pounds this time of year, and they will travel miles chasing a food smell. A cooler left out, scraps by the fire, grease on a grill grate, any of that can pull one in from a serious distance, especially a bear that already knows campgrounds mean an easy meal. 3 nights earlier, a bear had torn into a cooler at another site in that same campground, so the host had posted a handwritten notice at check-in afterward. The host had also pointed out the communal food lockers near the entrance. Glenn saw it. He left their cooler by the picnic table anyway, just tossed a blanket over it, and after dinner, they scraped their plates into a trash bag and set it by the dead fire, figuring they would pack it out in the morning. So I guess the question is, how many of us have made that exact same call? Pack it out tomorrow, it will be fine overnight. Most of the time, it actually is fine, which is probably why people keep doing it. Most of what happened after midnight came from the couple camped one site over, plus the physical evidence that was left behind. Sometime after midnight, the man in that tent woke up to something dragging across gravel. He looked out through the mesh window and saw a large grizzly at the Weaver's picnic table, already tearing into the cooler. From there, it moved toward the tent, probably drawn in by cooking residue on a pan sitting near the entrance flap. The neighbor heard the tent poles give out, then a scream, then fabric ripping apart. He did not go over. He grabbed his satellite communicator, sent an emergency alert, and set off the campground's air horn from where he was. And honestly, I don't think anyone could fault him for that. He did what he could from a distance. Going any closer would have turned one emergency into something even worse. By the time that sound actually brought help toward the site and the bear finally cleared out into the timber, Glenn and Angela were both gone. Glenn was found just outside the collapsed tent. Severe injuries across his head, arms, and upper torso, the kind of pattern that usually means someone tried to cover themselves during the first hit. Angela was found several feet away near the fire ring. Major trauma to her legs and stomach, which suggests she might have tried to run once the bear turned toward her. The medical findings put both deaths down to rapid blood loss from repeated bite and claw wounds. Glenn's injuries were concentrated around his head, arms, and upper torso. Angela had severe wounds to her legs and abdomen. The torn cooler, food waste near the fire ring, tracks around the tent, and the neighboring camper's satellite call log established the sequence well enough to close the case as a fatal grizzly attack connected to unsecured food at the site. Wildlife officers later trapped and removed a large male grizzly whose tracks matched those documented around the tent. The campground was closed temporarily while officers searched the area and replaced the old warning notice with stricter food storage instructions. The old picnic tables stayed, but the loose coolers and trash bags stopped being allowed at sites overnight. The joke was not really the issue. It was the attitude behind it. The assumption that being confident around danger somehow makes you safer from it. In southwestern Montana, a man saw ravens lifting from a meadow and walked toward them anyway, not knowing a grizzly was feeding just beyond the grass. It was June 6, 2016. A remote trail crossed an alpine meadow in southwestern Montana, where lodgepole forest opened into tall grass and scattered rock. The trail was popular with locals because it felt quiet without being too far from the road. At the parking area, a wooden board reminded hikers to carry bear spray and avoid areas where ravens were gathering heavily over the ground. Gerald Grant had been hiking and hunting around Montana for most of his life. He was 68, retired from surveying, and knew how to read tracks, wind, and weather better than most people who parked at that trailhead. A friend later said Gerald had a particular opinion about bear spray. He saw it as something something people carried when they did not trust themselves outdoors. That is not really what bear spray is for, though. It is not a confidence test. It is what gives you a chance once confidence cannot do much more for you anymore. That morning, he wore a sidearm on his belt and left an unused canister of bear spray in his truck. Grizzlies guard carcasses hard. It does not matter whether they made the kill or found it after the fact. Once a bear is feeding on something, especially in tall grass where it cannot see you coming, a person can walk right into its space before either side has time to react. There is no long standoff in a lot of these cases. Just a bear realizing something is close, and a person realizing it 1 second later. 2 days earlier, a trail volunteer mentioned ravens gathering in the upper meadow and suggested Gerald take the tree line if he saw them. Gerald treated it as normal spring activity and said he had seen worse. No sign to ignore this time, just somebody who knew that trail, telling him something was off. About 2 miles in, Gerald reached the meadow and saw exactly what the volunteer had described. Ravens lifted from the grass ahead of him in a thick, dark group, then settled again. There was also a smell in the air that the 2 hikers behind him would later mention when they gave their statements, something sour and heavy coming from the low part of the meadow. Gerald walked toward it instead of taking the tree line route. He did not see the elk carcass until he was close enough to make out the hide in the grass. The grizzly was feeding on the far side, mostly blocked from view. The first real sign Gerald had that he was not alone was the bear rising up from behind the carcass. At that distance, there was no real room to make a good decision. You were not reading body language or reaching for equipment. You were just suddenly too close. The attack was over fast. The bear charged across the short gap and hit Gerald hard enough to knock him backward into the meadow. It swiped at his head and upper body before biting the side of his head, then moved back toward the carcass. There was no long chase, no time to step back, draw the sidearm, or do anything useful with it. 2 hikers came up the trail soon after and saw the bear standing near the carcass from a safe distance. They stopped, backed down the trail, and climbed to a ridge where they could get enough signal to call for help. After making the call, they stayed well back on the trail and warned anyone coming up to turn around until officers arrived. By the time search crews reached the meadow, the bear had moved off and Gerald was already dead. The medical findings pointed to traumatic brain injury, skull fractures, and extensive damage to the scalp and face. His forearms carried defensive wounds, which showed he got his arms up during the first part of the attack. The elk carcass, the bear tracks around it, the hiker's call record, and Gerald's unused bear spray canister still sitting in his truck gave investigators a pretty clear picture of what happened. Wildlife officers did not remove the bear because the evidence pointed to a defensive response at a carcass site, not an animal seeking people out. The trail section was temporarily closed while officers monitored the meadow and arranged for the elk remains to be removed. I know people who carry a gun in bear country, and I'm not trying to start that argument, but a gun you cannot get to in time is just extra weight. Bear spray does not help if it is in your truck either. Beside a quiet lake in northwestern Wyoming, a backpacker went to sleep with a bear canister still packed away and food hanging close enough for a black bear to find. It was August 21st, 2017. A small backcountry lake sat beneath a timbered ridge in northwestern Wyoming, several miles from the nearest road. The site had no lights, no staff, and no easy way out once the sun was down. Just a few clear patches of ground between the trees where hikers set up tents. Ben Donnelly was 32, a graphic designer from Colorado who had been doing solo backpacking trips for about 5 years. He liked being out alone because it gave him a break from work, messages, and trying to organize plans around other people. He had planned a one-night stop at the lake before hiking out the following morning, which was why he packed light and kept his food bag within reach of the tent. The ranger at the trailhead had been warning people for 2 weeks about a black bear raiding campsites along that stretch. Food had to go inside an approved canister, away from the tent, not hung from a branch, not stuffed under a pack. The warning was direct, specific, and had Ben's route written on the board behind the ranger. I know a rule like that can sound fussy and when you are tired and staring at a one-night stop, but in bear country, those little steps exist for a reason. Black bears usually avoid people. That is worth saying because this is not the kind of story that happens every time a bear finds food. But bears that repeatedly get food from campsites can start connecting tents, cooking smells, and people with an easy meal. In rare cases, that animal gets bold enough to approach a tent at night instead of leaving when it finds the food. Ben reached the lake late in the afternoon and found a site near the tree line. He did not see any tracks near the tent pad, so he figured the bear had been working a different section of trail. Searchers later noted fresh claw marks on a low branch beside the tent site, another sign the bear had been working that section of shoreline. He cooked pasta beside his tent, rinsed the pot in the lake, then hung his food bag from a branch near camp. The bear canister stayed in his pack. Another backpacker was camped across the narrow lake, roughly 200 feet away. He woke during the night to a branch snapping, then saw a large dark shape moving near Ben's tent. He heard the food bag drop first. Then came the sound of the bear moving around the tent, followed by fabric tearing. He called out from across the water but got no answer. He sent an emergency alert through his satellite communicator. Crossing the lake in the dark, with a bear still somewhere near the tent, was not something he could safely do. He stayed inside his own tent, sent the alert again a few minutes later, and waited for daylight rather than crossing the water toward a bear he could no longer see. The emergency alert was received that night, but the official search team could not reach the lake until morning, leaving the campsite untouched for the rest of the night. What happened inside Ben's tent was reconstructed later from the damage and the medical findings. The bear had torn through one side of the tent and attacked Ben while he was still partly trapped in his sleeping bag. Injuries to the head and neck blocked his airway and caused severe blood loss. The bear left with the food bag sometime before dawn. The food bag was later found torn open in the brush behind the site, along with wrappers and scattered pasta. That gave searchers a clear reason for the bear to come into camp in the first place, even if nobody could say exactly when it shifted from searching for food to attacking Ben. Searchers reached the campsite after sunrise. The backpacker across the lake had stayed at a safe distance until daybreak, then flagged down two hikers coming in from the trail and warned them away from Ben's site while they waited for responders. Ben was found inside the collapsed tent. The medical findings attributed his death to asphyxiation from neck trauma combined with blood loss. The torn tent, damaged food bag, documented warning at the trailhead, satellite alert log, and bear tracks around the site established the sequence. Wildlife officers later captured a black bear near the lake after it returned to a nearby campsite and showed the same food condition behavior. Solo camping has that little lie built into it where every shortcut feels harmless because there's nobody around to question it. There's no second person there to say, hey, just use the canister. At a salmon stream in coastal Alaska, a man ignored two fishermen who told him a sow with cubs was feeding near the upper bend, then chose that exact bend to clean his catch. It was July 29th, 2018. A salmon stream in coastal Alaska cut through dense brush and timber, narrow enough to wade in most places but deep enough near the bends to hold thick schools of fish during the summer run. Bears used that same stretch of water constantly through the season, and the fishermen who came there knew it. Mitch Bowers was 47, a commercial electrician from Anchorage who had fished that stream most summers since his 20s. Bears were part of the landscape there, and he had spent years giving them space when he saw them. At the access point that morning, two fishermen mentioned a sow with cubs near the upper bend. Mitch had heard the salmon were holding there too, so he headed upstream with the same plan he had come for. He had driven out before daylight with his waders, a small tackle bag, and enough food for the day. The access trail was familiar to him, and by the time he reached the stream, a few other fishermen were already spread along the lower bends. There's a certain logic people fall into around a good fishing spot. You tell yourself you will stay aware and give the bears room. That only works when you can actually see them. Grizzlies along salmon runs can sometimes tolerate people at a distance, especially when fish are plentiful. Add cubs in close brush though, and that changes quickly. A sow focused on fishing may not hear someone nearby over the current. A person bent over cleaning fish may not hear her coming either. That is where the problem starts. Mitch caught 3 salmon and moved onto the bank to clean them. He crouched low with his back angled toward the trees and set the fish remains on a flat rock beside the water. The brush behind him came almost to the bank in that section, leaving no clear view more than a few feet back from the stream. The fish remains added another food scent to an area where the sow and cubs were already moving through, while the running water covered sound from the brush. The man across the stream later said he had noticed fresh tracks in the mud near that bend, but Mitch was already focused on cleaning his fish by then. A moment later, he saw the sow emerge from the trees with both cubs behind her. He shouted and waved at Mitch, but the stream was loud and Mitch was focused on the fish in front of him. The warning never reached him. The sow closed the distance fast and hit Mitch from the side, knocking him into the shallows. She bit across his abdomen once, then pulled back when he twisted away. The whole attack lasted seconds. The bear moved off toward the tree line with the cubs behind her, not circling back or staying near Mitch. The fisherman waited until the bears had cleared the bank, then crossed downstream where the current was shallow enough to get over safely. Mitch was conscious when he reached him, but he could not stay stand, and the wound across his abdomen was bleeding heavily. He got Mitch onto the bank, used his own shirt to cover the injury, and called the access point on a handheld radio. He kept pressure on the wound while he waited, but the injury was too deep and too far inside the abdomen for anything he had with him to control. There was no cell signal at that bend. A boat crew came upriver from the access point because the site was too far from the trail to reach quickly on foot. The current slowed the boat through the tighter bends, and that lost time was exactly what Mitch did not have. Mitch was loaded aboard and taken downstream, but he died before the boat made it back. The medical findings attributed his death to traumatic abdominal injury and blood loss. The bite had torn through the abdominal wall and damaged internal organs. Evidence included the fisherman's account, tracks from the sow and cubs, Mitch's cleaning knife, fish remains beside the water, and the radio log from the call for help. Wildlife officers treated the case as a defensive attack by a sow with cubs. The stream access was closed briefly while staff monitored the area, then reopened after the bear activity in that section had eased. Visitors were directed to use a designated fish cleaning station farther from the brush. I have fished with friends who will drive an extra hour for a spot they swear is better. This one makes me think twice about what good fishing is actually worth. At a remote wildlife lodge, bear sightings were supposed to be the attraction. The problem started when the bears stopped treating the guests as something to avoid. It was May 10th, 2020. A small wildlife lodge sat at the edge of a forested valley in western Montana, operating out of a converted ranch house well off the main road. Guests came for early morning views of elk, foxes, and sometimes bears from a wooden platform behind the cabin. There was no dependable cell service beyond the building, and the nearest paved road was a long drive away. Charlie Millard was 41 and had worked there as a guide for 6 years. She knew how to find fresh elk sign, where the foxes crossed the field, and when to get guests outside before the sun came up. Bear sightings had become a big part of the lodge's appeal, and staff later said Charlie had started leaving scraps near the tree line to keep bears returning close enough for photographs. That is a very different thing from a bear simply passing through. A grizzly that finds food around people over and over starts linking people with food. It stops giving the same amount of space. It comes closer, waits longer, and sometimes approaches directly when there is nothing on the ground for it. Wildlife officers had issued warnings after reports of food being left near the tree line, and the lodge had already been fined once for improper wildlife attractants. The operator had been told to remove food sources and keep guests away from the area, but the lodge remained open while the case was still under review. 3 days before the attack, a large male grizzly walked onto the back deck during breakfast. Staff moved everyone inside, cleared the food, and reported the visit, but Charlie kept the usual morning routine. One staff member later said he had suggested holding the scraps inside until officers came back. According to his statement, Charlie still took the bucket out toward the compost area before sunrise. I honestly do not know how a bear walks into the deck during a breakfast, and that is still enough to change the whole setup. That is not a bear sighting anymore. That is a bear joining the meal. On the morning of May 10th, Charlie took a bucket of food scraps out toward the compost pile before sunrise. That route passed the same tree line where scraps had been left before. It was the shortest way to the compost pile, and staff said she had used it almost every morning since the lodge opened. A staff member in the kitchen saw a large grizzly standing near the usual feeding spot before Charlie got there, but by the time he recognized what he was looking at, she was already outside. The kitchen door opened onto the back deck, and the tree line sat beyond that, far enough away that shouting would not have reached her before she passed the corner of the building. He later said the bear was standing near the usual feeding area, facing the lodge. From the kitchen window, it was hard to tell whether it had just arrived or had been there for some time. Charlie set the bucket down and turned back toward the lodge. The bear moved toward her almost immediately. The staff member watched it knock her down and bite at her arms and upper torso several times. The staff member later estimated the attack lasted less than a minute. The bear tipped the bucket over and dragged it into the trees. The man in the kitchen called for help over the lodge radio, but waited until the bear was fully out of sight before going to her. Charlie was conscious when he reached her, but she had deep wounds to both arms and her chest and was losing blood quickly. He used towels from the kitchen and a blanket to press against the worst injuries, while another staff member stayed at the radio. The lodge had a basic first aid kit, but nothing that could control multiple deep wounds across the chest and both arms. They were trying to buy time they did not have. The lodge sat too far from the road for help to arrive quickly. The radio call had to be relayed through a nearby ranch because the lodge could not reach responders directly from the valley. Charlie lost consciousness before emergency responders reached the property. She was pronounced dead shortly afterward. The medical findings attributed her death to exsanguination from repeated deep bites to the arms and upper torso. Evidence included the food bucket, the prior warning and fine, staff accounts, the radio logs from that morning, and lodge marketing that highlighted frequent bear sightings from the viewing platform. The lodge's operating permit was suspended while officials reviewed its food storage practices, guest safety procedures, and the reports made before the attack. Wildlife officers later trapped a large male grizzly in the same area after it returned to the lodge property and showed the same food-seeking behavior. The viewing platform was taken down during the investigation, and the food waste area was moved away from the tree line. I cannot say I feel much sympathy for the business itself. It sold people the idea that you can make a wild animal predictable if you feed it long enough. Charlie ended up paying for that idea in the worst possible way. On a ranch in southwestern Montana, a woman left cattle carcasses in a field after heavy rain washed out the access road, and a grizzly found the same food source before she did. It was October 5th, 2015. A cattle ranch in southwestern Montana sat between open grassland, tree-lined draws, and a seasonal creek that cut through the lower pasture. Heavy rain earlier that month had washed out the access track to the far field. Several cattle that died during an early season weather event were still lying there because equipment could not get through until the track dried out. Shannon Mayfield was 45 and ran the ranch with her brother. She had grown up around livestock, long days, and the general problem solving that comes with a property where something always needs checking. The carcasses were not being ignored exactly. The road was out, the ground was soft, and getting machinery into that field risked making the damage worse. Still, every extra day they stayed there made the field more attractive to scavengers. Grizzlies can travel long distances for an easy food source, especially in autumn when they are feeding heavily before winter. Livestock carcasses are about as obvious a food source as you can leave on a ranch. Once a bear finds one, it may return night after night, defend it, and spend more time near buildings or roads than it normally would. Ranch work is full of problems that cannot be fixed immediately. A washed out road, dead livestock, a missing calf, all of it gets sorted by what has to be handled first. A bear finding a carcass is not going to wait until you have time to deal with it. A neighbor had stopped by a few days earlier after finding large tracks near the lower field. She mentioned that they looked bigger than black bear tracks and suggested Shannon keep away from the carcass area until someone could check it. Shannon had seen black bears around the ranch before and figured that was probably all it was. The tracks were easy to dismiss when you had not seen the animal that made them. On the evening of October 5th, one of the younger calves failed to come back with the herd. Shannon and her brother had counted the cattle together near the main pasture, and she took the truck down to check the lower field while he finished the evening work closer to the house. She parked near the washed out track and walked toward the draw where the calf had last been seen. The carcass field was nearby, but brush and the slope blocked a clear view of it from where she came in. A grizzly was feeding behind a brush pile less than 30 feet away. The wind was moving from the draw toward the carcass field, which meant the bear would have had little warning that Shannon was coming around the brush either. The tracks, disturbed ground, and drag marks in the wet grass gave officers a clear reconstruction. Shannon had rounded the brush pile, and the bear charged almost immediately. She turned toward the truck but slipped on the soaked ground before reaching it. The bear caught her at the shoulder, dragged her across the grass toward the draw, and shook her several times before releasing her and returning to the carcass. There was no long pursuit. The bear did not follow her truck or remain near her after going back to feed. That mattered later because it showed what the animal had been defending. Shannon's brother noticed her headlights still pointed into the lower field well after dark. When she missed the evening feeding and did not answer his radio call, he drove down to look. He found her near the edge of the draw, conscious but badly injured, with deep wounds to the shoulder and torso and obvious trouble breathing. He called for emergency help over the ranch radio and used a coat from the truck to keep pressure on the worst wound while waiting. The washed out track that had delayed carcass removal also slowed the emergency vehicle. It could only get part way into the field before the crew had to continue on foot with equipment. Shannon was alive when they reached her, but the attack had broken several ribs and caused internal bleeding in her chest and abdomen. She died during the evacuation before they reached the main road. The medical findings attributed her death to blunt force trauma, multiple rib fractures, and internal bleeding, with deep bite wounds to the shoulder and torso contributing to the blood loss. Evidence included the tracks around the carcass field, disturbed remains, Shannon's boot prints leading from the truck toward the draw, drag marks in the wet grass, and her brother's radio log. Wildlife officers later removed the carcasses and set traps around the field. A large grizzly matching the tracks was captured nearby and removed from the area. The washed out track was repaired before the next winter, and the ranch began using a separate disposal area farther from the pasture.